Thank you so much to the Center of Latin American Studies for the invitation to give the talk on our book project from a couple of years ago on brokers, voters, and clientelism in Latin America and beyond. So I'll talk about the book and some directions for research that come out of our recent book, but I'm really pleased to be able to give a talk under the auspices of CLASS, which does so much for Latin American Studies at Berkeley. Okay, so this is our book that I'm going to talk about today. This is Brokers, Voters, and Clientelism, The Puzzle of Distributive Politics, which is co-authored work with Susan Stokes, who's a professor of political science at Yale, Marcelo Nazareno, and Valerio Brusco, who are both Argentine political scientists. There are a few ways to motivate what we try to do in this book. One is to ask broadly who benefits from distributive politics. And there's a prediction in the literature on targeting of clientelist goods that we take up forcefully in this book, not only because we think it's an interesting puzzle to answer, a question to answer in its own right, but also because it sheds light on some other ways in which distributive politics work in Latin America and other settings. So it's a whole set of theories in political science that predict that benefits should go to swing voters or undecided, unpersuaded voters. And the logic is compelling. Why spend money targeting voters who would vote for your party anyway? So why target loyalists, or why target convinced opposition voters who won't be swayed by the promise of some benefit? That makes a lot of sense, and indeed one can find agents in the field who echo a similar logic. So this is a Peronist activist in Buenos Aires who says parties give goods to undecided voters to attract more people. Voters who prefer the party are already on their side. So we've done a whole lot of interviews in this project with Peronist activists, or brokers, as we call them here, and some of them will echo this logic in statements. The theoretical argument is straightforward. The problem, it may not be supported by the facts. And so we've done some extensive empirical research in this project, I'll talk about it here, that suggests that actually loyalists of parties receive far more in the distributive game than swing or undecided voters. We find that swing voters receive too few benefits from the perspective of this theory, at least, while loyal voters, those whose strong preference for the party should make them unresponsive, receive too many. So this is an important puzzle in its own right, this observation that loyal voters receive too much from the perspective of perceived theory. But it also opens the door to some new theorizing and testing about the role of brokers in developing world democracies. So I want to get to that in a moment. So what does existing literature, what do existing theories say about why loyalists might be targeted? Some emphasize turnout or turnout buying. So basically there's a problem with getting voters to the polls, and so those who would vote for the party, if only they turn out, are natural targets for largesse. The goal, however, is not to buy their vote or persuade them, but instead to mobilize them to turn out. If that were true, you can imagine that it would be a typology of electoral targeting by voter type that looks something like this. So you'd have something like certain voters, sort of a conceptual type, of voters who always turn out election after election to vote. Potential voters, those who don't always vote. And we know that in Latin America, even systems with obligatory voting sometimes feature lower turnout rates than 100%. So mobilizing voters to the polls can be important. And so targeting certain voters or loyal voters and targeting certain and potential voters and loyal voters and swing voters leads to this kind of typology of persuasion and mobilization. So the canonical story is we target swing voters who are certain to vote. We're going to buy their vote and not waste money persuading loyalists. That's what we call persuasion here. But an alternate strategy is mobilizing potential voters who would vote for the party if they were only to turn out to the polls. So those are loyal voters. So you can imagine the parties are doing both things. They're persuading and they're mobilizing. And so some of the existing work says this is why we see some benefits going to loyal voters. It's because they're being mobilized to the polls. So persuasion and mobilization are both going on. So this is a conjecture that we want to test, and I'll present some empirical approaches in a minute that we use throughout our book to test this conjecture of persuasion versus mobilization. I'll say that when we started this project, we actually thought that this might be what's going on. So we have a kind of an elegant theoretical account that parties sometimes persuade and they sometimes mobilize, and we thought about the conditions under which they might do one or the other. What we found, again, is that the empirics seem to contradict that supposition. In fact, there's too much persuasion of loyalists going on than received accounts would suggest. So even certain voters who are loyal are receiving benefits more than one would expect theoretically. So this leads us to a conjecture about the role of brokers. Parties sometimes are thought of as unified teams of actors seeking to win election. In fact, they're composed of many agents, sometimes with divergent interests. And in clientelism in particular, that is the exchange of benefits in a quid pro quo for political support, brokers play a really critical role. Because they're embedded in long-lived social networks, they're the ones at the local level who are actually solving problems for voters, who are distributing resources between elections and at election time. They have close knowledge of voters' preferences. So how is a party going to know who's a loyal voter and who's a swing voter, who's a certain voter and who's a potential voter? Brokers are the ones, because of their embeddedness in local social networks, who have access to that kind of information. Party leaders don't. And they're the ones who actually monitor political behavior. In settings where clientelism needs to be enforced, that is, there's a quid pro quo of benefits in exchange for electoral support, voters often require some kind of monitoring by local brokers. Indeed, enforcing the clientelistic bargain is challenging for parties because of the, among other things, because of the secret ballot. So there's an incomplete contract where parties promise benefits or give benefits in exchange for the vote from voters, but there's nothing in principle to stop voters from, as I say, in Latin America, many places in Latin America, taking with one hand and voting with the other. And so one can take benefits with one hand and contradict promises in the voting booth. So brokers play a critical role in monitoring local behavior. What we think is that theorizing the political agency of brokers can help explain a number of anomalies. In particular, the anomaly with which I began, that loyalists are targeted at higher rates than prevailing theory would suggest. So brokers have interests that are sometimes distinct from party leaders, and there's an informational asymmetry. Brokers know things that party leaders don't, and that allows brokers to take advantage of their position in ways that has interesting consequences for distributive politics. So let me save the rest of that argument for later in the talk. Just back up a bit and mention the kinds of questions that our book addresses. So first, one contribution is conceptual. So we want to know, how can we best distinguish between forms of distributive politics? A lot of terms are thrown around in this literature: pork, clientelism, patronage, vote buying, turnout buying, and it's important to have a conceptual scheme that allows us to distinguish between these forms of distributive politics, and that's one of the things we try to do in this book. Then we are interested in how distributive politics works at the micro level. So what's the micro level of the micro logic of distribution? Who gets targeted under what conditions, why and when? And the first part of the book is about those micro questions. So I'll focus a lot on that in this talk, the question of who gets targeted and why, and with what implications for distributive outcomes. But one of the big questions we're interested in, and the kind of macro question we're interested in, is also what induces changes in the kinds of distributive strategies that parties use. In particular, when do party systems switch from being more clientelistic to engaging in other forms of distribution, say programmatic distribution, which I'll define in a minute. And then we also think in the end of the book about some of the normative problems that are attached to distinct forms of distributive politics. So let me talk first about the conceptual scheme. So we draw a distinction between programmatic and non-programmatic distribution. These are terms that are used elsewhere in the literature. We define these in the distinction between these forms of distribution in a particular way. In particular, we ask whether the rules of distribution are public and whether the rules or criteria for distribution shape actual distribution in fact. So whether in a setting in which, say, legislators debate who should be eligible for particular kinds of programs, perhaps on the basis of means, so means-tested programs, where income determines eligibility for receiving some benefit. Where those rules are made public and where they actually shape who gets benefits, we call that programmatic distribution. Everything else is non-programmatic. So if either the criteria are secret or they don't shape actual distribution because, for example, we establish an income eligibility criterion, but in fact it's one's partisanship or one's political behavior that determines who gets benefits, that's non-programmatic politics. And then within non-programmatic politics, we want to also situate clientelism as a particular form of distributive exchange. So the key question for distinguishing clientelism from other forms of non-programmatic politics is whether receipt of benefits is contingent on individuals' political support. So there's got to be a quid pro quo. If there's a quid pro quo in which benefits are exchanged for some sort of political support, that could be voting or turning out at a rally, expressing support for a party in other ways or a candidate in other ways, we're thinking about clientelism. We're in the clientelist branch of the diagram. The other forms of non-programmatic politics that don't involve a contingency or an explicit quid pro quo we call partisan bias, and we distinguish between situations where benefits are targeted at individuals or at groups. So that's where we have pork barrel politics, group-based, non-programmatic targeting. And then we call benefits targeted at individuals under the partisan bias branching, part of the branching diagram, electoral diversion of public policy. Clientelism is the other part of the branching diagram, and we distinguish between clientelism that's directed at party members, loyalists and activists. Often that takes the form of jobs, as patronage, and largesse that's directed at voters, as vote buying or turnout buying. So those are various forms of clientelism. So that we think, because these terms are used in a lot of different ways in the literature, this kind of conceptual brush clearing is useful to think about what we're actually studying in this book. We're studying the contingent distribution of benefits to voters or to party members in exchange for political support. So we're studying clientelism. Okay, so let me turn to the kind of micro question I began with. How does political loyalty drive benefit receipt? It's very hard actually to test how political support shapes the targeting of benefits. So the reason is that political support, for example, might itself respond to the targeting of benefits. So rather than being a cause of benefit receipt, it's an outcome or result of targeting. So there's reciprocal relations between political support, particularly expressed political support, say in a survey, and the receipt of benefits. There are also many omitted variables that drive both political support and the targeting of benefits. So income could well be one of them in a lot of Latin American contexts. If the party of the left or a populist party is distributing benefits, it may be that their supporters are naturally eligible for benefit receipt by virtue of income and also prone to support the party. And so those kinds of omitted variables drive both political support and the targeting of benefits. There are a few ready natural experiments. So this is a form of research design in which, for example, political support might be as if randomly assigned. In natural experiments, we seek to find random or as if random variation in a treatment variable or an independent variable, and that cuts the reciprocality and it cuts the emitted variable bias because randomization ensures that those who receive a treatment and those who don't are equalized as groups. That's challenging here. So just imagine a setting in which, try to consider a study in which political support for a party is randomly assigned, and immediately one sees why that would be a challenging design to find. So there are a few ready natural experiments. So we're going to test different aspects of our theories using different research designs and some unique data sets combined with our field work in Latin America and other settings to try to make progress on testing the ideas. So I'm going to talk about three empirical designs today where we look at how political loyalty and turnout propensity shape benefit receipt, using some unique data from Venezuela on party leaders, from India on voters, and an experiment with brokers in Argentina. I think each strategy has some limitations, as you'll see. We think together they make a compelling case for the idea, first, that loyalists are getting too much in the way of benefits, and then they also will help us provide some explanations. Okay, so let me turn first to Venezuela. So the data come from the context of the 2004 recall campaign against Hugo Chavez. So in 2003, there had been an attempted coup 2 years prior against Chavez, a general strike, and low oil prices. And Chavez faced a very competitive campaign leading up to the August 2004 recall referendum. So it was a petition to recall Chavez from office. It looked like he would lose the petition. He did not have majority support at the time the petition was launched. And so there was a massive petition drive organized against him. There was also, at the same time, a petition launched against some opposition deputies, deputies of the political opposition to Chavez. That referendum didn't actually come to pass due to some judicial decisions, but the recall petition was launched. And the data source that we use in this study comes partly from records of petition signings. And so Venezuelans signed petitions either for the recall, i.e. against Chavez, for the recall of Chavez, or for the recall of opposition legislators, or did not sign. And those data were recorded by the Electoral Commission and subsequently actually made public. So there was a deputy named Luis Tascon who obtained these records and initially published them on his website. The records eventually made themselves into a searchable database with a user-friendly interface called the My Santa database that was distributed to local party activists in Venezuela. And so the records of petition signings, which were linked to citizens' national ID numbers, or cédulas, we're in this database. What's interesting about these data is that they give us ex-ante measures, if you will, of the incumbent's perceptions of voter type, that is, partisan affiliation, and also propensity to turn out prior to the initiation of massive targeted spending programs. And so after the recall election, in particular, during the recall and then after the recall, there's a huge run-up in the price of oil, the Venezuelan budget swells, and a number of targeted programs called the Misiones were begun, some of which offered individual benefits to Venezuelans. And so the question is whether the ideology of the voters, or partisan affiliation, if you will, of the voters as recorded in the My Santa database is linked to subsequent benefit receipt. And because the benefit receipt comes after, it doesn't answer all causal questions, but helps a little bit with the reciprocal causation, since the spending distribution had been limited before the initiation of the recalls. Okay, this is what the My Santa database looks like. This is the user-friendly interface. It's searchable by cédula or by name of voter. And when you enter a number, in this case the cédula 1888, this is the information that's returned. The principal point of interest for us is whether the voter is a loyalist, a swing voter, or an opposition voter. So a swing voter is somebody who didn't sign against the president and didn't sign an opposition petition against an opposition deputy. So here it says, no firmó contra el presidente. That's a swing voter. Somebody who signed the recall petition against Chavez is an opposition voter, and somebody who signed against the opposition deputies is a loyalist. So we have a three-part distinction between swing, loyal, and opposition voters. There's also some information in the database that tracks turnout. So that's here, the abstencionista measure, whether somebody has been prone to turn out in the past or not, and also whether they had already received some benefits from a few incipient misiones, which were starting around the time that My Santa was put together. As I mentioned, the social programs really hadn't gotten much underway at the time this was put together. They expanded dramatically afterwards. So the prevalence of benefit receipt, even in these incipient programs, is low. The abstencionista measure, actually, it's not entirely clear on what it's based. For example, it's not clear to us whether the inclusion rule is you've abstained in some past election or you've abstained in some certain number of past elections in order to be qualified or classified as an abstentionista. But what's important from our perspective is it gives a measure from the incumbent government's perspective of who is an abstentionista. So we have measures of political ideology and of turnout propensity from the point of view of the incumbent government. And as this was distributed to the local activists who are actually distributing benefits and enrolling people in social programs in the misiones at the local level, we think this gives us a way to look at how the incumbent perceives turnout propensity and partisanship shapes the distribution of benefits. Okay, so this looks like the cells the typology I showed before, where we distinguish between certain voters and potential voters on the one hand, and loyal voters and swing voters on the other hand. And remember, the prediction of the prevailing theory is that we ought to see most of the action in one of these two cells. That is, either we should be seeing persuasion, so we should see targeting of certain voters who are swing, they didn't sign either recall petition, or maybe of potential voters who did sign against the opposition but are also abstencionistas. In fact, that's not what we see at all. We see a lot of action, more action in the upper left cell. That is, certain voters who signed against the opposition are receiving benefits disproportionately in subsequent social programs. So we track, by the way, participation in the social programs in a number of ways, primarily from our own household survey that we took subsequently and asked about benefit receipt under the misiones at the household level. We were then able to match the records from the household survey back to my santa using the cédulas, the ID numbers. So we're able to match the ex-ante measure of political ideology to benefit receipt in that way. Okay, so this is another way of looking at the data, and we see that beneficiaries, loyalists tend to be disproportionately beneficiaries of these programs. You might ask whether loyalists are beneficiaries simply because of omitted variables like income. That would be a natural conjecture. The poorest are likely to receive benefits under the misiones and are also tend to be disproportionately Chavez supporters in Venezuela. Even among the poorest 20%, one sees a similar pattern. That is, it's the loyal voters who are receiving the benefits disproportionately. Okay, so that's my santa. We have, there are some limitations here. This is one context. It's also possible that there are omitted variables we're not measuring. That's always the Achilles heel of these kinds of studies in observational, i.e. non-experimental settings. We look at a few other kinds of programs to make progress on this question in a different way. So we look also at the connection between partisan ties and benefit receipts in India, where we did extensive research gathering information on who had received benefits from local village councils. We consider the presidents of local village councils local activists. They're brokers in our sense as well. And so we have, like in Venezuela, observational data on the party relationship between citizens and the council president, the panchayat president. And so we can look, as we did in Venezuela, at the connection between partisanship and benefit receipt. And we find there as well that loyalists tend to disproportionately receive benefits. What we also do in India, which we couldn't do in Venezuela, is to randomize in a survey experiment the partisan ties between respondents and hypothetical candidates for village council president. And then we ask survey respondents how likely they think they would be to receive benefits. We also ask them about their vote intention, whether they would vote for this candidate or not. The candidates in the hypothetical vignettes are the same across all of for all voters. What changes is whether the hypothetical candidate that's described is a co-partisan member of the same party as the voter or not, and that's randomized. So we know that that the groups who view co-partisans and the groups that don't are equated in expectation on average across the groups. And so thanks. And so what we find is substantial effects of copartisanship on both vote intention and particularly important for our purposes, expectation of benefit receipt. So these are the averages on a 1 to 7 scale under the copartisan condition. These are the averages under the non-copartisan condition. This is the difference and the standard error for the difference of means. And the differences are substantively large for these kinds of studies. They're about a half of a point on the 1 to 7 scale. That's about between a quarter and a half of a standard deviation on the outcome variable, and they're statistically significant, very unlikely to have arisen simply due to chance. So partisanship affects vote intention as well as expected benefit receipt in this experiment. We do a number of other things in the book with the India data, but I wanted to highlight the experimental evidence since we don't have that. We didn't have that in Venezuela for voters. In Argentina, we look at the brokers themselves, the activists themselves, and we ask how do activists distribute benefits and how do they perceive the role of partisanship and turnout propensity in distributing benefits. And so what we do here is take basically a probability sample of brokers, which we think is the first of its kind. It's a tough population to survey, and identifying a sampling frame that is a list of brokers from which we would sample randomly in order to be able to characterize the population of brokers is challenging. And so we did this in 4 Argentine provinces. And the way we did it is to sample municipalities at random in each of the 4 provinces, and then to randomly sample and survey city councilors within the 4 provinces. Now, councilors themselves often can be thought of as brokers. They're often responsible for a particular neighborhood. They often started as very low-level activists and worked their way up the party chain. So they're kind of brokers in their own right, or have been brokers in the past. But we also asked in our interviews with the city councilors for the number of brokers working for them. And then later in the interview, we returned and we said, okay, so you said you have 12 activists working with you. Could you give us their names? We'd like to interview some of them. And so we recorded the names and we sampled from the list. I say semi-probability sample because this is where the probability aspect breaks down a bit, in that there's some selection in the names that people give to us. We were able to try to pin people to the number that they'd stated early in the interview, but that wasn't always possible. It wasn't always possible to interview all the brokers whose names had been given to us. We think we have a probability sample of city councilors who are often themselves brokers, and something that may be representative but isn't quite a probability sample of the activists that are working for them. And then we asked in our interviews of these brokers a series of survey experimental questions that get at some of these hypotheses about who gets targeted. And so, for example, we said in one question, suppose that the mayor of a hypothetical municipality called a broker and gave him access to 10 social assistance programs with which to mobilize voters. This is the typical language used to describe these kinds of benefits that are exchanged in local transactions. The broker has 40 neighbors who need assistance, and then the part in bold is varied experimentally across versions of the questionnaire. We say, for example, suppose all of them always turn out to vote, or suppose that the broker cannot count on all of them to vote of their own accord. So we're varying the turnout propensity of the described voters. Among them, there are neighbors who prefer the party of the broker and others who are indifferent between the parties. To which type of neighbors would the broker give more programs? So we ask questions like this of the brokers. Again, these are hypothetical vignettes, but we're trying to assess their perception of who would be likely to get benefits. And from the broker evidence, too, loyalists are disproportionately likely to receive benefits. So first of all, here the loyalists are about twice as likely to receive benefits according to the brokers as swing voters. We also find that turnout propensity, I don't have the come back to some of this later and don't have it all in the presentation, but we find that turnout propensity doesn't work in the ways predicted by the theory either. That is, it's not the loyalists who are unlikely to turn out who are receiving benefits disproportionately. It's loyal voters who always work. Okay, so this is evidence, and I hope it convinces you to some extent that partisanship or express loyalty to a party and turnout propensity don't work in the way that the received theories say they should. We have a whole lot of other evidence. It's tough to get around all of the, what a social scientist calls the endogeneity problems. So we use some other strategies in the book, including instrumental variables analyses. You have to hold where we instrument for partisanship of a child with the partisanship of their parents. You have to hold your nose a little bit at those analyses because some of the key assumptions probably aren't met. But in the main, we think convincing evidence that the patterns of distributive politics don't reflect the prevailing theoretical wisdom. So a big component of the book is to try to explain why this divergence emerges. And we think that a theory of broker-motivated mediated distribution does a lot of the work. And so let me walk through a bit of this theory in a fairly schematic way. So under clientelism, parties distribute benefits to individuals and attempt to hold them accountable for their votes. But they need to target benefits to the right voters, often those with the right kinds of partisan preferences. And that requires substantial information. That's why machines or clientelistic parties hire armies of intermediaries or brokers to help them with these substantial informational tasks. The problem is that brokers also, while solving those informational problems for machines in principle, also create problems as well. In particular, they don't have necessarily the interests of the party leaders at heart. So when we started to think about this theory, we were very impressed both by the fact that brokers play a critical role, but that their agency hadn't been properly discussed or theorized in the social scientific literature. And we found, my co-authors and I found in interviews across Latin America that party leaders would actually express dismay at these brokers working under them. You know, if I could just only get rid of these, these activists are causing me so many headaches, was something we heard in Mexico, we heard in Argentina, and in other contexts as well. And so we started to think more about these agency problems that may exist between brokers and party leaders. And we analyze a model in the book where there are three actors: voters, brokers, and party leaders. And this is what we assume about each of these actors in the model that we analyze. First, leaders want to win elections. They do so in part by spending resources on responsive voters. So they, in fact, would like to target the swing voters, as the prevailing theory says. To make voters responsive, that is, to elicit information about who should be targeted, they hire brokers. Good brokers can indeed make voters responsive, given a budget that's transferred to them. Brokers, however, while they want their party to win, also care about extracting resources from party leaders. And how do they extract resources from party leaders? They do it by building big networks of beneficiaries, using the resources distributed by party leaders. So in Argentina and many other contexts, brokers are responsible for bringing voters to rallies. And what's observable to party leaders who show up at those rallies is not whether swing voters or loyal voters are there, but how big the network is. How many voters do brokers manage to marshal to come to these events? And that creates a difficulty for the brokers because there's some disutility to voters participating in these events. So voters in the context we're studying are often shuttled off to rallies. There's a cost involved in time and in effort, and so they have to trade off that cost against the benefits that they get from brokers for participation. So they may get help solving problems or help with access to social programs if they participate in a broker's network, but that also is costly. So in our model, more effective brokers build larger networks, and parties reward brokers with large networks. Brokers have two objectives. They want to build big networks to get rewards, and they want their party to win. They produce votes for their party by distributing benefits to responsive voters, but they build their following most efficiently, in fact, by spending party resources on the loyalists. So the intuition is that given their ideological or partisan proximity to brokers, they're easier to organize. So what we're thinking is about settings where there's at least some dimension of ideology that distinguishes parties. Might not be true in every setting, but it's true in the settings we look at in Argentina, in Venezuela, and Mexico, probably also in India. And it may not be ideology in sort of a left-right dimension. Sometimes it is. It's also partisan proximity or closeness to a party, which might be independent of ideology or not strictly the same as ideology, but people have long-standing partisan ties often in these settings. And the key idea is that a lifelong Peronist in Argentina is easier to turn out to a Peronist rally than a lifelong radical or an indifferent swing voter. It's costly to go to a rally, but gee, if you're going to go to a rally, you'd sure rather go to one of a Peronist leader than a radical if you're a Peronist. And translate Peronist and radical to, to the PRD and the PAN and the PRI, or to Congress and other parties in India, and the logic is similar. There's some partisan tie that makes it less costly to go to a rally of a candidate who's actually shares your partisanship. So, brokers who want to build big networks do so by targeting loyalists. That's the core. That's the core of the idea that we're advancing here. Leaders can't, in fact, induce brokers to act as perfect agents of their party because they can't observe the mix of swing and loyal voters that brokers bring to rallies and cause to participate in other kinds of political acts. And that leads brokers to extend resources on a mix of responsive and unresponsive voters. I say unresponsive because getting benefits doesn't change their vote. Conditional on being in the ballot box, as they often are in Argentina, which is a setting with obligatory voting, though not everyone votes, but most do. Conditional on voting, they're going to vote for the party sincerely anyway, so the benefit isn't causing them to change their vote. Okay, so one of the insights that comes out of this is that, or one of the ideas is that clientelism brings both benefits and costs for vote maximizing party leaders. So one of the questions we turn to, especially in the more macro portion of the book, is when do the costs trump the benefits? In other words, for party leaders, what might it make sense to forego clientelism as a distributive strategy and turn to other kinds of targeting strategies, like universal cash transfers, for example, which don't require brokers. Everybody who's below an income threshold or who meets certain conditionalities, like putting their kids in school, is eligible for a transfer, receives a transfer. No brokers are required. There's no targeting by partisanship. So you lose, as a party leader, you lose the capacity to elicit votes by targeting the right voters, but you also get rid of the brokers. The brokers are costly because in our theory they're targeting some of the wrong kinds of voters some of the time. They're also extracting rents in our theory, by the way, which I didn't focus on, but they're skimming some off the top for themselves. And so for party leaders, there are costs and there are benefits. So the question is, when do the costs trump the benefits? And we look in our model at comparative statics. So how does, say, increasing the income in the electorate change the attractiveness of clientelism to party leaders? How do changes in the discernibility of the vote, so how easy it is to monitor voting behavior, affect the incentives to engage in clientelism? This is like some previous work that emphasizes some comparative statics that might shape clientelism, like income. But it's distinct in that it's really focused on the decision of brokers and how the agency relationship between party leaders and brokers changes as factors like discernibility of the vote, income, and so forth change. So that gives us some predictions that we look at in the macro section of the book about when clientelism declines. It's hard to test, again, these predictions with strong designs, but we use our broker survey and also historical evidence from the US and the UK to assess some of the key assumptions and conclusions. So one of the things we're really impressed by in our historical work is how much the end of machine politics in the UK and the US had to do with leaders colluding against their brokers, often across party lines. A little later and a little slower in the US than in the UK. But in fact, one could imagine there's a prisoner's dilemma between party leaders who would prefer it if everyone gets rid of brokers, but they don't want to unilaterally defect from a clientelistic strategy, because then the other party is using clientelism and benefiting at the polls. In fact, what we find is that in some settings, it becomes a dominant strategy for both of the parties to simply get rid of their brokers. And so in the historical evidence, we find collusion across party lines, liberals and conservatives. In the U.S., the story is a little bit more complicated, but basically party leaders actively seeking to undercut their brokers. Okay, so we use the survey evidence also from Argentina to look at some of the observable implications of the model. So assumptions and observable implications. Are we thinking about the problem in a way that has empirical support? And that's some of what we use the evidence to look at. So one of the things that this theory presumes is that brokers have a lot of information. Brokers think they have a lot of information, at least. That's what this figure suggests. In fact, brokers say, over 70% of brokers say that they can tell if one of their clients or their voters votes for another candidate. So that they think at least that the secret ballot is broken in the setting. So they have a lot of ability to enforce transactions with voters. Social networks, face-to-face interactions with voters on a daily basis give brokers a lot of information about both what voters prefer and what they do. It's also the case that brokers are paying to build their networks, as the model suggests. So they're not just paying in exchange for votes, but they're paying in exchange for participation in visible events that party leaders can observe. So we ask questions like, out of 10 brokers, how many would pay for participation in rallies? This is asking about other brokers here, but the average answer is greater than half. So majority of brokers are, as indicated by the vertical line there, a majority of brokers are paying for participation. And then again, as I mentioned, brokers are building heterogeneous networks. This is also a prediction of the theory that they are targeting some swing voters, as the theory predicts, but also loyal voters who are certain to turn out. So we simply ask brokers, out of every 10 voters, how many fit these types? And in the survey, we don't use language like certain loyal, certain swing, potential swing, etc. We use terms that convey in a more vivid way what we intend. But brokers say that they target substantially target certain loyal voters. That's the upper left figure. About half are voters who always turn out to vote and who are loyal to the broker's party. But that's not all they're doing. So they're also targeting certain swing voters, though less than half. That's the upper left. And they target some potential loyal and some potential swing voters as well. So they build heterogeneous networks. They also capture rents, by the way. So we ask, out of every 10 brokers, how many keep benefits for themselves? About half do. They say about half do. So brokers pose a cost to party leaders in that way as well. So we look at some of those assumptions and implications. We also look at another implication, which is that of the claim that party leaders have different incentives than brokers. So there's some kinds of distribution that are controlled by brokers at the local level using their privileged information about voter preferences and behaviors. But there's some kind of targeting that party leaders more directly control, in particular aggregate targeting. So targeting that goes to municipalities or districts. The party leaders control, and the prediction of this model is that leaders should distribute benefits to swing districts, even as brokers distribute benefits to loyal individual voters. So that's also something that we look at and find some evidence for in the book. Okay, so the comparative statics also suggests that the incentives of brokers to target loyal voters and extract rents as opposed to targeting swing voters efficiently from the point of view of leaders varies across settings, and that's going to influence the attractiveness of broker-mediated distribution for party leaders. So indeed, when clientelism is attractive, we have something that looks like a prisoner's dilemma between competing parties, meaning nobody wants to unilaterally defect from clientelism. But when the underlying conditions change, we find that transitions, in fact, pit leaders against their own brokers, against their own machines. Okay, so that's kind of a taste of what's in the book. I didn't talk about all of it. I'd be happy to do so in the Q&A. Let me just conclude by saying that we think that despite the centrality of brokers to clientelistic forms of non-programmatic distribution, scholars have failed to theorize their agency and to recognize both the costs and the benefits that broker distribution and clientelism bring for party leaders. And so we think that greater attention to the role of brokers may explain anomalies in targeting patterns like the ones I've described, where parties target loyal voters. But but also many other puzzles in distributive politics as well. So that's one gain we think from this theory of broker-mediated distribution. We also think that greater attention to brokers can help explain when the costs of clientelism may outweigh the benefits. So it gives some insight into shifts from clientelistic to other forms of distribution. And indeed, we're seeing shifts in Latin America today. So although clientelism remains pervasive in a number of settings, even in Argentina, where it's perhaps most pervasive of all, there's moved to universal kinds of distributions at the same time. So programs like the universal, the distribution program that gives benefits on the basis of every child, so distribución universal por hijo, has this more programmatic, or at least non-clientelistic feel, in which the probably programmatic, in which the rules are public and they guide, and the criteria actually guide distribution. Elsewhere in Latin America, with the rise of conditional and unconditional cash transfers, a focus on broker mediation can help explain why those kinds of programs may be politically attractive in some settings. In fact, in many settings, it's parties without brokers that have massively expanded these programs as well. So there's another twist on the argument, which is that those programs can be attractive to people for whom political leaders for whom clientelism is particularly unattractive. So think about the expansion of CCTs in the Brazilian Northeast. The PT didn't have a lot of brokers or pre-existing support network. When it rose to national power, those kinds of programs are plausibly attractive to parties for that reason. Okay, so it's very hard to say what's going to cause transitions away from clientelism, though. We have some theory, and we have historical work in the UK and the US, but we think it's important for future research to probe some of those empirical implications, in particular how shifts in the power of brokers can reinforce or undermine clientelism. So there's been some work that looks at, tries to take advantage of random variation or as if random variation in the power of brokers to understand what happens to clientelism. So, for example, if some of the tools of brokers are taken away from brokers for exogenous reasons, if you will, then that may shift the power of brokers and affect what voters do. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say for the formal presentation, but I'd be really, really happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Questions?
Anna.
So I was wondering, do we have any evidence of opposition parties guiding this kind of shift away from clientelism? Because a lot of the discussion you mentioned kind of involves, government-funded projects and subsidies. I was wondering if there's any evidence of, I'm thinking specifically of Fujimorismo, which has really worked hard to build a party kind of against all odds. It's kind of like the prototypical case. And I think it's really interesting because I think there's been a real shift away and an insistence by party leaders not to use clientelism.
Yes, so let me say a few things about it. One is, I think an important question is how kind of competitive clientelism might differ from what we've described here, which is thinking about a single incumbent party with brokers, and that characterizes the kind of monopolistic clientelism characterizes many systems, but not all. And so before thinking about whether opposition parties have incentives to move against clientelism, I think it's important to draw a distinction between dynamics that might occur in settings with more than one clientelistic party and settings with a single monopoly. In the single monopoly setting, it might be more intuitive that opposition parties would have incentives to move against clientelism. On the other hand, it's striking the extent to which opposition parties without a lot of incumbent resources at their disposal can build something that look like machines. And so we were really struck by this. I was really struck by this in field research in Venezuela, where the opposition, which has been I'd say systematically disadvantaged in electoral competition over the last decade, has nonetheless built something that looks like clientelist machines in certain parts of the country. So Petare is a poor area of Caracas where the opposition is part of the municipality of Sucre, and the municipality has been governed by an opposition mayor who's really recruited disaffected brokers from Chavismo, old brokers who used to work with the parties COPE and ADE that existed before the rise of Chavez, and has really recruited them and started to build a party machine. So that doesn't exactly answer your question. In fact, it's the opposite. It's opposition parties building clientelistic machines. But there are certainly examples of opposition parties building platforms in opposition to clientelism and being successful in doing that. And so one of the reasons that might be attractive is that there are a set of voters who reject clientelism and who would be attracted to that appeal. So Rebecca White Shapiro is a political scientist who has a book that argues that middle-class voters dislike clientelism, and in settings of heightened political competition in particular, sometimes the incentives to subvert clientelism are strong because those voters end up being pivotal, and they really don't like clientelism. So there's certainly work out there that suggests that. There's a question back there.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thanks for today. Very, very interesting. One of the things that I've been thinking about as you were going through the presentation was whether you can talk a little more about how the linkage between the brokers and the party takes place. It seems to me, I mean, on the one hand, the sort of clientelistic cycle that you are describing is in a way like a high point of sort of end point in a way of a long process of linkage. That seems very important, especially when you're emphasizing the role of the broker, because in a way, by emphasizing the role of the broker, that question, your original question, can be pushed back in that the question isn't which individual voters receive redistribution, but which brokers receive it, right? So in the Venezuelan case, for example, the question would be not whether loyalists as individuals receive it, but whether loyalist brokers received redistribution, and the linkage between the broker and the party can have like its own peculiar history that has potentially nothing to do with distribution flows.
Yeah.
Right? So,
yeah. It's a great question, and I think the problem from the point of view of the parties is also to recruit the right kinds of brokers, which we more or less abstract away from. It seems intuitive that parties want to recruit loyal activists, that is, those who maximize the party's goals, who take the party's objective function partly to heart. They want the party to win. This may partially actually benefit the brokers in a personal sense as well, because it's part of their career building. But they also want the party to win for kind of ideological or partisan reasons. And so parties, it seems plausible that parties want to recruit that kind of broker. They also want brokers who are effective in targeting voters. But the problem comes in that that being the case, and I think you're right that that's the outcome of a longstanding set of relationship-building activities on the part of parties. Even so, if brokers hire loyalists as brokers, those brokers may have mixed objectives. So they want their parties to win for selfish reasons, they want their parties to win for partisan and ideological reasons, but they also want to be rewarded. And brokers who are rewarded are those who demonstrate efficiency to the party. So they build big networks, and that can bring the temptation of targeting cheap voters, who aren't high-quality voters from the point of view of parties, even in settings where you have really good brokers. So I think you're right that it cuts into the problem at a particular point, that there's a long trajectory of network building and of forging ties to activists. But, parties often do that by sussing out, participation over time by activists. They want to find activists who aren't switching between parties all the time. Some do. But those are kind of swing brokers, and parties like to have brokers who work for them over time. In part because they're better brokers because they probably internalize the party's objectives more efficiently, more wholly. Other comments? Yeah.
I was just curious about you mentioning the broker system or community clientelism in American and British history. I was wondering how maybe I would refer to those things referred to, because terms are ringing a bell to me in American history, but could you just...
Machine politics, basically, would be the U.S. history term. So think Boss Hag or think Tammany Hall. So these are urban activists who are first out to the fire and helping helping poor voters. So Tammany Hall is probably the classic reference, and it's all about brokers, if you will, in our language, helping voters who have problems and conditioning though that help on their political support. Sure.
Yeah, just wondering, you've skirted through Mexico. I was wondering if in the book you have made any research focused on the country and what have you been, if you could summarize your findings on that area?
Sure.
If that's the case.
So we do study Mexico in the book. Our primary kind of empirical cases for a lot of our original research and primary research are Argentina, Venezuela, and India. But we use, there have been panel election studies, so there's some very nice data in Mexico that allow us to look at the relationship between partisanship and benefit receipt over waves of a survey, many of them in the pre-electoral period and others in the post-electoral period, that give us some additional purchase on this first question I started with, which is it loyalists who receive benefits or swing voters? So we can look at partisan ideology at the start of a campaign before benefits are really being extended in the sort of transactional sense of here's a benefit, please vote for me, in the lead up to a campaign. And there too we find that it's the longstanding loyalists who disproportionately receive benefits. So we study that in Mexico, and we also discuss a bit the rise of CCTs and so forth, and programs like Progresa and Oportunidades in Mexico, a little bit from this perspective, but it's not our primary case. But there is research there, and we reach similar conclusions about who is targeted and about the incentives to undercut targeting by brokers. But I will say it's one of the cases that in some sense inspired our intuitions about the costs of brokers. So the PRI in particular has been a party that's depended heavily, traditionally on local activists who are both a benefit to the party and a pain in the neck to the party, and so that motivated a lot of our thinking.
Well, I think we are out of time, but I want to thank Professor Dunning for his presentation, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you.